Before we begin, this episode contains references to thalassophobia, drownings, trances, family violence, pregnancy issues, self-harm, suicide, mania, the deaths of children, famine, and the supernatural. Listener discretion is requested. There are 10 pilgrims at the mission. When something goes awry, 9 pilgrims at the mission. 1 lets out a cry. 8 pilgrims at the mission. 1 lost their sight. 7 pilgrims at the mission. 1 tried with all their might. 6 pilgrims at the mission. Something calls out. 5 pilgrims at the mission. Cursed with mortal doubt. 4 pilgrims at the mission. Something called your name. 3 pilgrims at the mission. Escaping all but blame. 2 pilgrims at the mission, they sang both night and day. 1 pilgrim at the mission arrived to go away. There are no pilgrims at the mission, and still the mission stays. There is a red stone church built deep into the sandy soil at the center of the Igrula Valley. It's one of those strange structures that has a history much longer than anyone's memory. And though stories of this place have filled both scroll and tome, they offer very few consistent facts. This is a place, as are many in this realm, which does not want to be documented, but it does need to be known. People in the surrounding hills have come to know that, at some point, when you come of age, you learn about it, about the Crimson Mission, and what it's done, and why you do not go there, even when it asks for your pilgrimage, even when it calls you by your name. Tonight's episode is a little different, as you've probably surmised. Instead of presenting facts and theories about an ongoing, singular investigation or cold case, with suspects and motives, we here at Alchemy Investigations have delved into our archive and put together 4 stories about the Crimson Mission. How it may have come to be, how it came to grow, how it convinces you to stay, and how it has come to now be abandoned. At the center of these stories are 2 questions, dear investigator. What lives in the Crimson Mission? And what would you do when it called your name? This time on Alchemy Investigations, we explore, through first-person accounts, the hunger and the want at the heart of the abandoned Crimson Mission of the Igrula Valley. As we sift through unbelievable story and unreliable narrator, we will become all too familiar with this site of offering, decay, absence, and tragedy. As the children's rhyme reminds us, there are no pilgrims at the mission, and still the mission stays. Stay tuned, investigators. Greetings, investigators. With you again is Ichabod M. Groster, lead dispatch for Alchemy Investigations, the realm's foremost private investigatory body. And this time we're telling stories. Stories about a seemingly abandoned church far from most settlements, deep in the humid jungles of the Igrula Valley. Heading north from the Tosley Pass, a day's journey or so into the thick foliage, one finds themselves in a clearing, with several structures made out of red stone, unlike anything in the surrounding biome sandstone and shale. According to travelers and local guides, the stones let out a pleasant sound at first. It cuts through the thick air, and it's a warning to those who know it and an invitation to those who do not. And that's where the truth becomes murky. Most accounts, those that survive, will detail the din of the red stone structures, the prelude of the Crimson Mission. But beyond that, a concise, conclusive history is hard to find. It seems that anyone who survives that place has a vastly different story to tell, that is, if they're lucky enough to survive and tell one at all. The stories we've selected for you, dear investigator, run a very, very long timeline. The first is so old, so profoundly ancient, the valley itself did not yet exist. Instead, the area was covered by a sea, which facilitated trade routes between pert but foregone cities and coastal towns. One such place, Ville de Rennes, still to this day tells the story of the Gloria Moss, a merchant ship which set to sail, returned but once to say goodbye, and was later found without her crew, abandoned, dead in the water on a sea which no longer exists. This is that story, the story of the Gloria Moss. Much of this tale comes from the scrivener's notes of Old Kelv the seer. Old Kelv was a mystic and astronomer in the very early days of Ville de Rennes. Hers are some of the only proto-histories that have survived from that era, as she enchanted her writings into living stones which would speak back her words. Unfortunately, while these stones survived and the magic remains potent, the very early languages of Ville de Rennes have drifted so far from the common tongue that a great deal of transcription and translation is required. As such, I hope you will permit some interpretation on my part. Also, I should mention that, while we do not have an exact date for the final sailing of the Gloria Moss, no one does, it does describe a time when the Igrula Valley was covered in a saltwater sea. So you can imagine it was quite some time ago. Listen well to the sad story of the Gloria Moss, a good ship found, though her crew now lost. Their families went too, down to the sea, a voice called them home, a din set them free. But what of us, with so many gone? Without our neighbors, off hither and yon, doorways darkened, a song on the tongue. No butcher, no captain, no cobbler, no one. As it would happen, the Gloria Moss was a merchant ship which moved Ville de Rennes jewelry across the sea to ports along the near western coast. It returned with luxury stones and precious metals. At the time of its disappearance, the ship was captained by Lord Byron Atuck and owned by the Ville de Rennes Merchant Consortium. By all tangential accounts, the ship was in good stead before the loss of its crew, and others, more on that in a bit. Every 16 days, it would make a round trip, offloading forged gems, jewelry, and trinkets in far ports, and coming back with raw stones and materials for the Ville de Rennes Artisan Guild. Given the somewhat valuable nature of the cargo, to sail aboard the Gloria Moss meant quite a bit of trust. Captain Atuck, it was said, was discerning, clandestine, and prized security above most other virtues, which made what happened to the Moss all the more confusing. Nothing about the Gloria Moss's final voyage seemed out of the ordinary. It initially left port with no fanfare, the winds were strong and orderly, and it would have gone unnoticed save for what happened 4 days later when the Gloria Moss returned to the Ville de Rennes port, making an unscheduled and nearly 2 weeks early arrival. But that was not the only irregularity. The Moss, which usually anchored out in the bay, relying on smaller tinder vessels to load and unload it for security reasons, sailed right up to the port. Captain Atuck must have requested that the ship come to rest right off one of the piers in the main dock, just floating right next to the shore. Dropping anchor but not lowering the gangplank, the Gloria Moss sat in the port all day and all night. No lights or cooking smoke, no hail or greetings or flags to communicate. Nobody, not a soul coming nor going, it just sat there silently. And according to Old Kelv's record, the entire crew was seen standing on the deck, facing the town, baking in the setting sun. They said not a word, they made not a move. They just stood at attention, silently, a whole ship of watchers waiting. The story goes that just before dawn, the gangplank was lowered, and silently the crew crept off the ship and into the sleeping town. They went to their homes and woke their families. Old Kelv does not elaborate on what the crew members said to their sleeping households. Assumedly, it was quite convincing because family by family, still in their night clothes, the relatives and close friends of the crew walked the streets of Ville de Rennes down to the docks and boarded the Gloria Moss. They packed the ship to the gills. Only then, in the cold morning light, could cheers be heard coming from the deck and the hold. The Gloria Moss was filled and happy, and it set sail once more without a word. leaving the dock and the bay. While Captain Atuk's command was beyond reproach, this unscheduled and unsanctioned departure and equally unscheduled arrival was apparently too much for the harbor master, who chased the Gloria Moss in a pursuit sloop. She was unable to catch the Moss as the seas had become inexplicably choppy and hard to traverse, but before the chase was relinquished, the harbor master would attest that she heard a song on the wind coming from the deck of the ship. She said it sounded like the chime of a church bell. Now would be a good moment to speak about Captain Atuk himself. After what is about to happens, a great deal of inquest went into Captain Atuk's history and solvency as a leader. The short story here, according to Old Kelv and several supplementary artifacts, is that he was a naval man who left the service. He married his sweetheart, fathered 3 daughters, and he sailed the Gloria Moss from port to port over the Igrula Sea every 16th day for almost 10 years. Although the numbering system is somewhat inconsistent, it may have been 13. There's some debate about this. He was awarded medals. He was held in some of the highest esteem that Ville de Rene could offer. He never deviated. He was almost never late, according to memory, and by all accounts, he was the paragon of what we think about when we think about a grizzled but genuine captain. Descriptions of a portrait of him by Old Kelv later indicate that he even had a salt and pepper mustache. Textbook. Just textbook. But the Moss never made it to its first port. Almost immediately after the ship left Ville de Rene Bay for the second time, craft were commissioned to give chase and find the rogue vessel. At very least, Lord Captain Byron Atuk had to explain what was going on and why the ship had, without any warning or permission, nearly quadrupled its crew complement with families, relatives, and friends. The Moss wasn't found on its trade route. It had clearly departed from that as well. And for a time, the Gloria Moss was nowhere. That is until word came in to Ville de Rene that the ship had been found by a traveling sea caravan, drifting far from any known landmark in open water. As was reported in the arcane communication, "Please send your fastest to this place, and hurry. A great tragedy has befallen the Gloria Moss." And a great tragedy it was. Nearly 14 days after the Moss's initial departure and 10 days after it re-embarked, with so many on board, the Ville de Rene merchant marines sailed into view of the derelict craft. And what they found cemented the Gloria Moss in our memory, from that day in near prehistory to this moment, as I relay it to you. One of the boarding crew, Deck Cadet Aubrey Alisteri, wrote a surviving memoir. Later in life, she would hold political office in Ville de Rene, ushering in a golden age for the city-state. And this story starts off her autobiography. It's a prologue to her character and connection to the merchant community of the city that she would eventually grow to prominence. She was one of the first aboard the Gloria Moss, and reports the following. "She was empty. No crew, no animals, no cargo. Her sails not pulled up, but torn down and missing, not violently, not ripped, like a surgeon or a doctor with a clean blade. There was no signs of combat nor struggle, not a drop of blood spilt. The Moss must have drifted for days, but before, they must have wanted to stay. They must have wanted to hold position. I'm sure they would have dropped anchor if the sea floor permitted. The Viewmont tracked back against the current to find where the Moss was meant to perch and eventually found a trail of abandoned cargo, which became a trail of clothing and personal effects, which became something so troubling I won't bear to mention it here. Blessings be to the sad tragedy of the Gloria Moss and her crew and passengers. May the gods keep them." It would seem that they all entered the water with no struggle, as if they wanted it, like babes who would be baptized. While the Viewmont sailed north, we stayed aboard the Moss, checking each room and preparing the ship to sail back to home port. Not too long after, the bosun and one of the wee mates found Captain Atuk's quarters locked. After some work, they broke down the door, but the fates could not have prepared us for what we saw. Ulia Atuk, the middle daughter of the Atuk family, not 14 years, upon her father's cot, a small wreath of seaweed upon her head and her hands clasped as if in prayer, her poor heart beating no longer. This would prove to be more troubling than initially thought. Ulia's body showed no sign of violence, which meant that she either died peacefully in a repose fit for a painting, or someone laid her there after she passed, locking the door behind them. This brings us to the part of the story that most people know, the part that you tell around campfires, the dark jokes shared between sailors when they call each other Little Rose during a squall. On the port side in the main hold, Deck Cadet Alisteri found several sheets of parchment tucked into a seam which seemed to be written by Ulia Atuk, documenting the final voyage of the Gloria Moss. As the deck cadet's memoirs have been translated and maintained over time, so too have these final words. Papa woke us up. Sisters, Mater, and I rushed. Papa whispered something in Mater's ears, which made her smile wide. We were to march down to the ship together quickly. Papa had come back for us. I've never been on his ship before, and I was so excited. The whole town seemed to be aboard. The crew had come and gathered their husbands and wives and parents and children and so many others. Rumors spread. One family said that this was a vacation for good work done. Someone said that the crew had found a paradise island and they wanted to share it with those they loved, though many said nothing at all, instead singing hymns like the ones we'd sing in the temple. But oh, something is wrong. Everyone stopped speaking. By the night on the first day, everyone just sang at the top of their lungs, a song I do not know. My sisters are singing, even the littlest who can barely speak. Where did they learn these words, and why don't I know them? The ship has stopped, but the singing is loud and thrilling. Even through a hoarse voice they sing. They sang as they ripped down the sails. They sang as they tossed boxes and crates and barrels overboard. They sang as the first of them dove into the water. I begged Mater to stop. I grabbed her frock, but she, with the littlest in her arms, sang ever the louder. I couldn't stop it. I ran down to the hold where I write this now, and I hear splash after splash, and the sound of singing has grown quieter and quieter. Forgive me. I am alone now. It's quiet, and I do not know how to sail this ship. There are no rafts, no tenders, and now there are no songs and no singers. I summoned the courage to look overboard just once, and I saw Eli the butcher's son. He was surrounded by so many others. I looked away. I could not bear to see Mater or my sisters, and I have tried in vain to remember that song, to sing it myself, to hear what they heard, but I just can't sing it right. Finally, there is this last entry. It seems to be written down at some point after the purported mass drowning, and I cannot say for sure how long Ulia remained about the ship. And this should be, of course, taken with some skepticism. Clearly, the young girl had gone through an incredibly traumatic event. But the words that Alisteri found were these. Papa is alive. He's alive. He's knocking outside on the hull, and a voice, I hear it calling out. Little Rose, little Rose, little Rose. That's Papa. I'm saved, and surely he'll sail us home. The ghost ship of the Gloria Moss was towed back to Ville de Rene, and immediately a cleric was brought in to revive Ulia as her testimony would prove invaluable. But apparently, she could not be awakened by supernatural talent. As the cleric reported to the merchant consortium who paid for the revival, if a soul is unwilling, it cannot always be retrieved. The Gloria Moss's crew found something in that water that was so important, so sacred, that they retrieved everyone who mattered to them in the whole world, and sailed back to the middle of the salt sea, back to the middle of nowhere, with just a hymn on their tongues that they may have well learned from the water itself. Why little Ulia couldn't join them in their song, I will never know. What we do know are threefold truths. 1. The makeshift journal, Ulia's journal, was found in the hold of the Gloria Moss. That's below deck. And Ulia was found above deck, dead in the captain's quarters behind a door that needed to be locked from the outside with a key. 2. Old Kelv was a noted astronomer, a scholar of the skies. And 1 month before the Gloria Moss lost its way, Kelv wrote of fire in the sky, streaking down to the sea. She called it a terrible omen. And 3. Deck Cadet Aubrey Alisteri was the first daughter of a mapmaker. She kept excellent notes, and if you were to use them to backtrack the Gloria Moss from the spot where it was found to the spot where it meant to stop, where those converts made the plunge into the frigid water, that spot when time passed and the Igrula Sea dried up, becoming the Igrula Valley lush and verdant, that spot in the sea floor would be a day's ride from the Tosley Pass, a place where now pilgrims come to pray in the red light of the Crimson Mission, hungry in the jungle, as it was on the sea. What, dear investigators, called out from beneath that ebb and flow? We'll explore that further after our break. This particularly spooky episode of Alchemy Investigations is brought to you by Countess Otto's Anti-Aging Serum. Don't like those unsightly lines? Want to keep your hair looking bright and youthful? Contact Countess Otto's Forever Young Consortium for your free consultation. Side effects may include day sweats, temporary loss of appetite, light to moderate vampirism, and dry mouth. Remember, we can't beat Mother Time, but we can elude her under the cover of night. Our second story tonight comes by way of the notes from an art history lecture offered by the famed bardic historian, Dr. Gossamer Mox. Dr. Mox specializes in methods of cultural preservation, and he published a paper 9 years ago entitled Painted Folklore, The Hidden Occult Tragedy of Mirabelle of Igrula, as depicted in Starcy Japenda's The Crimson Lady of the Valley. A mouthful for sure, as many academic titles are. For our purposes, it's going to be useful to break down this title into its parts, so that we may become oriented. A very long time ago, probably when your great-great-grandmothers were just children, a woman, at the end of her own life, named Starcy Japenda, painted a landscape painting called The Crimson Lady of the Valley. This image, painted on a cedar board, depicts the lowest part of the Igrula Valley in dark reds and blacks. At the center of this image is the outline of a reclining woman in ceremonial religious dress. This woman is meant to be Mirabelle of Igrula, a former nun who took up residence in the Igrula Valley. She is said to have built the Crimson Mission's first structures, relaying via letters her thoughts and intentions to her niece, a small girl who would grow up to become the famed artist Starcy Japenda. So, in the timeline, long after the Gloria Moss was lost and found and the sea levels fell, revealing the valley below, a nun named Mirabelle came to the land and built what would become the Crimson Mission, detailing the process to her young niece, who would later paint her understanding of the scene in the now famous The Crimson Lady of the Valley painting. Much, much later, Dr. Mox would do a great deal of research to contextualize this effort in his scholarly work. Dr. Mox writes, Before we can fully appreciate the artistry of the Crimson Lady, we must do the work to learn about how the eponymous subject came to the Igrula Valley in the first place. Several hundreds of years ago, though accounts here can be challenging to verify as the area is remote and confirmable record-keeping is not the local priority, There was a great famine to the west of the Igrula Valley, and it displaced vast swaths of people who moved into parts of the region to stake claims and attempt to rebuild their lives. Settlements like Tosley and Corvaray were founded around this time, largely from immigrant populations escaping the famine and the political instability which inevitably followed. But our concern is a singular pilgrim, one who fled the famine and, at some point on the road east to Tosley, broke off from her traveling companions and walked, seemingly by herself, into the deep and wild jungle. This woman, who we will come to know as Sister, soon to be Mother, Maribel, was Starcy Japenda's paternal aunt, and I posit that her writings had a profound impact on our artist. Studying this relationship will give us a more tuned insight into Japenda's work, and her final painting in particular. Famously, Dr. Ivan Rist intoned that Japenda spent her whole life with what happened to her aunt at the back of her mind, only releasing it into the world when her own health began to fail. She could no longer contain such an enormous truth. So, for a time, Sister Maribel seemed to settle in a remote part of the Igrula Valley, living alone in the dense jungle, notably having no formal survival training, having spent the preceding decades in a convent, but thriving in Igrula nonetheless. And then the letters began. It is unclear to me how these notes found their way to little Starcy, living just southwest of the capital. Perhaps Maribel trekked back to Tosley and sent them by post there, but the sheer fact that she was able to send them at all really does speak to the preternatural tenacity of this former nun. Many who study the Crimson Mission hold Maribel in a very important light. Lady Bester of the Oprex Academy, who runs an archive concerning evil-aligned martyrs, once wrote that Sister Maribel may be a poor fit for her collection, as it is unclear if the mission made her wicked, or if quite the opposite. Regardless, her letters to her niece are informative to our project here. And so Maribel wrote, "Dearest Starcy, I have been tested. I am safe, but I have been tested, and I have starved. And I have run, and I have slept while waking so that I might run some more. But do not pity me this, nor have your father pity me. But do light 3 candles at the temple, 1 for me, 1 for you, and 1 for the light which guides us. I could not stay with the others. They have been crushed under doubt and pain, and I need to follow what I know to be truth. The wilderness here is filled with life, and I hear it in every bird song and insect call. I have made my home deep in the thick of it. The light has called me to a clearing where no trees can grow. The light has called me through the darkened canopy to be protected in its glory, and I am safe here. 3 candles, little star, no more, no less. Please." Ichabod here. Dr. Mox will, from here on out, do a fair bit of quotation from Maribel's letters to her niece. As a fellow academic, I respect the commitment to finding and including these letters as they are relevant artifacts, but as with many scholarly products, it can get a little wordy. To better prepare you, I would like to describe the Crimson Lady of the Valley, the painting in question. Unfortunately, ours is an ear-based medium, and the original painting is in the private collection of one Dame Zaxon Miswit, though I have very little information beyond that. In memory, the painting is large, nearly 2 of my arm's lengths wide, by 1 in height. The edges of the image are a pure black, the sort which almost seems enchanted to shift and displace as you move your eyes across it, like the paint is still flowing, despite having been dry for centuries. As we draw our gaze closer to the center of the piece, the dark sections become broken up by what looks like foliage, creating layers of ambient shadow and depth. That's where the figures start. Behind the trees appear all manner of person, short, tall, old, all with their backs turned to the viewer, barely discernible against the dark background, save for a sliver of light, red, cresting over the shoulders and tops of heads. Imagine, hidden in the dense jungle, droves of people standing at attention, like worshippers at a sermon, each individual, but none distinguishable, backlit by sharp, crimson light. As we move ever closer to the center, the tree line ends, and so too does the onlooking congregation. Now it's just an open clearing, the odd section of dirt and sod broken up by what looks like lumps of stone. But close inspection shows that these are depictions of people. who have come to lay still face down in the dirt, as if they were walking out of the trees into the clearing and were crushed by some large weight or wind, the bones of the odd arm or leg sticking up into the night sky. And at the center of the painting is the church, which Mirabelle herself built, with steps leading down into the crystalline terrain, the eponymous Crimson Mission. And at the base of this church, emanating radiant, rose-colored light, there is a woman rendered in a classically figurative way, such that the painter wanted us to see her sallow face and her sunken eyes, her face agape and distorted, her body clothed in opulent Orthodox regalia, so near death, either the moments right before or the moment held just after. The woman in the painting is being caressed and cradled by a shape, an intentionally ugly shape, contrasting with the finesse of the figurative work on the woman, Mirabelle. The shape, which seems as if Japenda spilled a pot of ink to achieve the effect, is holding Mirabelle in a delicate repose, like a holy mother over a child. The importance of the shadow is given relief from the enervated form of the broken Mirabelle. Before it became privately owned, people would claim to see objects in the shadows of the trees. And given what we know about the area, I am not the least bit surprised to hear that one of the most cited objects hidden in the visual noise of the near-negative space is what looks like the anchor of a great sailing ship, out of place among the landlocked jungle. But to try to understand how all of this came to be, we need to return to Dr. Mox and the Lady of the Valley's letters to her niece.
Dearest Darcy, 3 more candles when you can. Today, the light is a light of purpose. I see it, yes, but I also hear it. Overtaking my eyes and my ears, I feel it in my body, like a kick, like a voice which cheers you and makes great works possible. You can see it, can you not, in the eyes of your heart? A sanctuary in the clearing, a holy place amidst the noise and darkness of the jungle. It needs me. It needs me to do what I must do. I was first called to the convent, now again much louder. I know what I have been called here to do, little star, and one day you will know what you have been called to do. I just know it. I know that if I have to carve it out of the stone with the bones of my fingers, I will dig into the rocks and stones until they be altars and steeples. I shall grow this place of purpose and light, and someday, little star, you will come see it for yourself with your eyes. You and your father and everyone we know. 3 candles at the temple, dear. Don't forget.
From here, Dr. Mox goes on in his lecture.
It goes without saying that these letters take on a very unsettling demeanor very quickly. Whether we would attribute that to an infirm mind or to the trauma of the famine and subsequent displacement, I am unsure. Mirabelle of Igrula had been living alone in the wilderness for several months at this point, which makes the following letter and its revelation ever the more complicated. Keep in mind, too, that at the time, Starcy Japenda would have been no older than 12. Dearest Starcy, I write to bear a miracle unto you. Miracles are gifts that we can give by telling, by calling a name in the wilderness, and no sooner had I begun to dig in the land beneath me, no sooner had I removed the first bright red stone, did I feel it. I certainly thought that it was impossible, grown from my soul into my body. It is confirmation of purpose. I will build in this place, this site of work and worship, so that I may thrive, so that I may bring into this place new life. Please, little star, light 4 candles. 1 for yourself and 1 for the light, but do spare 2 for us. The 2 pilgrims in the mission now. So Mirabelle would carry a child. How this child came to be is very unclear. Beyond magical and spiritual abilities to create life in this way, false pregnancies have also been commonplace in times of trauma and unrest, so to say one way or another with certainty is not possible. But I also believe that Ms. Japenda was deeply affected by these letters, and this letter in particular. As I was able to view these messages in the Japenda ephemera collection in Malort, I could see how she stored them when she was alive. It was in a small metal box with a lock. She carried that box with these letters in it from place to place, from childhood to old age. And the more I read through her journals and notes on the subject, the less I believed the lock was to keep prying eyes out, and much more to keep the letters, or simply their intent, sealed away. At very least, to make it more difficult to open the box should Starcy desire to reread them, allowing her a moment to reconsider as she fumbled with the key. As you well know, Starcy Japenda became the court artist for Zarina Cosgrove of Malort, and her style, while figurative, was used to make the royals of the court look beautiful and wonderful. Her work is often cited as the preeminent leader in the new luminescence movement, privileging bright colors, muted contrasts, and cohesive depictions of subjects smiling with rosy cheeks and bright, big eyes. This is not at all surprising, as few leaders want dour portraits of them and their families. Few intentionally wish to appear unwell or ill at ease. But despite the cheery nature of her work, Ms. Japenda would often take to bouts of inconsolable sadness in her adult life. She would often toil into the night on these uplifting works of color and vibrance, and then sleep much of the day. She rarely gave lectures, nor lessons, and would, on occasion, disappear for weeks at a time. After the death of her father, who would have been Mirabelle's brother, Starcy Japenda left the court, and in fact, left public society altogether. As it would happen, the last time she was seen was 2 days after her father's burial at the Temple of Light in the Malort city capital. She gave confession to the cleric and, it would seem, she vanished. Until her death 4 years later, when she was found, along with the recently completed The Crimson Lady of the Valley painting, in her apartments near the Fife's Elder section of Malort City. She was found without note nor letter, no will nor testament. She just passed on, laying in her bedchamber, the painting set up before her so she might regard it from her final repose. Despite the sad end of Starcy Japenda, I do want to remind us all of the light and beauty she offered to this world, how she could cultivate a smile out of young and old, and as the Cosgrove family said at her funeral service, we only wish that we could live up to the joy that Madame Japenda painted behind our eyes. I am unclear how many letters were sent to Starcy when she was a child. The ones I can verify are months and sometimes years apart. It would seem that Mirabelle, while apparently pregnant, hand-built several structures into the open grove in the Igrula Valley. Depicted in some of these letters are a main building, which Mirabelle called the sanctuary, a long boarding structure, which she called the host, and a tower, which she called the steeple. Additionally, there are a few references to smaller outbuildings and a burial cairn, where she would presumably lay believers to rest, though, aside from her and perhaps her unborn child, I do not know how these tombs would come to be filled. Now, I am not a structural engineer nor a gifted artificer, and there are plenty of magics in the world which might shape these ruby-like stones into the aforementioned buildings. To my knowledge and research, Mirabelle did not possess such arcane talents, though it would seem she was able to build these masoned edifices by hand while with child alone in the jungle. My own mother would often say that no magic can stand between a mother and a better life for her child, and I suppose that sentiment is true, and if so, Mother Mirabelle would certainly be its patron saint. But most perplexingly, and I must stress that the time frame here is hard to verify, but given the time between letters and placed using dates in Ms. Japenda's personal journal, Maribel did not give birth for 2.5 years after the first mention of her child. She just carried it while building the Crimson Mission, seemingly by hand. In her final letter to her little star, or at least the last letter that Starcy Japenda kept in her collection, Maribel of Igrula shared the following, closing out her message. I can feel the urgency now. As I place the finishing stones in the narthex, I didn't know I'd be making a bassinet to welcome your cousin. Your little cousin. We have a bed for you too, little star, as I will need you to witness. Because what good is a story that we can't tell? We'll keep watch for you. Please do light 4 candles again, my dear. And please, don't keep the light waiting. To my knowledge, Starcy did not visit her aunt when she was invited. She did, I propose, visit much, much later. As part of my research for this publication and presentation, I was able to secure a grant and visit the Igrula Valley, taking a trip of my own to the Crimson Mission, to verify some of the depictions in Ms. Japenda's work. It is an odd place, made all the more odd by my understanding of how it came to be. Travel made, of course, all the more complicated by much more recent events, which are not the purview of this academic study. When arriving at the mission, one sees the structures mentioned by Mother Maribel. There is indeed a church or temple at the center with a cellar that is very much in disrepair. It would seem that Maribel used the crystalline stones to construct the load-bearing elements of the mission, and utilized wood or some other less permanent material for many of the walls, as those have fallen off. The boarding structure only consists of incomplete redstone pillars, and the steeple is much more of a spire now, like the crow's nest of a ship. Of course, the burial site and the cairns have been enchanted, and I was not permitted in there. Not at all a surprise, given Vos Gareth and the Ornamental Order's mass suicide 5 years ago. The locals are still very sensitive to that, and I, being a good visitor, observed these limits as well. Walking around the space, I couldn't help but imagine the maniacal, wide-eyed Mother Maribel summoning an impossible strength to terraform this place, to raise the stone like 1,000 polished rubies, constructing a radiant church. In its own infancy, it must have been a truly impressive and incredible sight. I was standing inside the sanctuary with its now sunken ceiling, and something came over me. I asked one of the guides from Tosley to steady me, and he walked me out into the sun and let me sit a spell away from the mission. When I felt more myself, I turned around and realized something. The view from where I happened to be standing was familiar. Not abstractly familiar, actually familiar. It was the exact view of the church from Starcy Japenda's painting, the exact perspective. I have studied that painting for 3 decades, and I know it as well as I know my reflection, and I know that at some point before her last days, Starcy Japenda had come here and stood where I was standing. It was a realization for me as an art historian. We often think of artworks as sites of memory, but we are not often in a position to use an artwork to uncover a truth once buried, a truth once locked away. Japenda came here, to this place, to take up her aunt's invitation, however late, and at the end of her life, she painted this view. I must have had a terrible look on my face, because the guide insisted on turning back to Tosley. He said that if we did not leave soon, we would be caught in this place at night, and that was not a good idea. He said that we had to return to Tosley before the last bell stopped ringing. I had been at the mission for hours, and I had not heard a single bell, but he clearly had, and that worried me greatly. We left immediately and said nothing on the long trek out of the jungle. Thank you for coming to this lecture. I hope it has been illuminating for you, and I offer this in closing. The letters sent to young Starcy Japenda clearly burdened her with a great psychic weight, one which had a profoundly stressful effect during her lifetime while simultaneously providing the backbone of a prolific and culturally important career. Despite the value in knowing this complex connection to the Crimson Mission and Mirabelle of Igrula, I would encourage you to meditate on the power that extremes may create. As Voss of Herakla reminds us, each feast was once a living beast, and each tear shed creates room in the eye to see beauty. It would seem that Starcy Japenda gave all her joy to the world through her art, and saved one last bit to memorialize her dear aunt, lost to the jungle Igrula, for better or worse.
Dr. Mox is famous for his academic performances, and while I do think that he will oftentimes forego the rigors of scholarship for a good story, in this case I'm glad he did. While there are other stories about Mirabelle, many fall into the misogynistic and misguided quote-unquote evil woman in the woods trope, which I think undersells both the incredible architectural work she was able to accomplish and the profoundly complex correspondence she shared with her niece. As it stands now, after the Gloria Moss was lost in the Igrula Sea, and the sea itself dried up, the Crimson Mission called out to Mirabelle, a lost soul in need of purpose, and convinced her to build a place of congregation and fellowship. In time, this site would become the focus for disappearances, hauntings, murder, and a very notable ritualistic mass suicide. Whatever is at the center of the mission, it clearly needs company, preferring those who cannot leave. Fortunately for us, we can, as that is, in fact, where we will have to leave it for today. To properly tell the story of the Crimson Mission in the modern era, from the diary of a thief who would pilfer one of the red stones to the now infamous Ornamental Order mass suicide, we will require the time and space of another full episode. But don't worry, by the end of this two-parter, you should feel confident enough to walk into the Igrula Valley and conduct a productive investigation, regardless of what you might hear on the wind. Thank you for listening to tonight's episode, part 1 of a two-part edition. In this first half, we have looked at the origins of the Crimson Mission of the Igrula Valley. We have recounted the tale of the Gloria Moss, who lost its crew in the sea above where the mission would come to be built. And we have explored the supernatural underpinnings of Starcy Japenda's depiction of her aunt as she built the mission's first structures. Looking ahead, we will hope to answer the questions: what causes the strange events near the Crimson Mission, and how can we learn more while not succumbing to its thrall? This has been Ichabod M. Groster for Alchemy Investigations. Farewell until next time, investigators, and beware.
Alchemy Investigations is produced at Else Break Labs and is hosted by Ichabod M. Groster. This episode and its related materials are released with absolutely no warranty nor support and are distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. If you are interested in learning more about tonight's mystery or want to explore others, please click the link in the description or visit us at our website, alchemyinvestigations.com. There, Ichabod will explain the resolution of this particular scenario and offer tips on how it might be run as a tabletop role-playing game one-shot or as part of a larger campaign in your next game night. Tonight's story, all names, characters, and incidents therein are works of fiction. No identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, structures, ideals, and/or products is intended, nor should be inferred. Alchemy Investigations is supremely thankful to our wide network of correspondents. Correspondents like the illustrious Dr. Gossamer Mox, who allowed us access to his lectures and footnotes, but not endnotes, which we understand and respect. We would also like to extend a sincere thanks to Mr. Ganymede, the docent at Dame Zaxxon Miswit's private collection. We appreciate your help, despite not being able to visit the gallery itself. And of course, thanks to you, dear investigators. Stay well and stay curious.